This video will teach you all you need to know about soldering glass. I'll show you the main technique that I use when soldering. And also, I have Kurt, who has zero experience, and he'll be following along with you guys.
I'm a little nervous for today's portion, but excited nonetheless.
I got you. Let's get started. Safety is always super important. We will need safety glasses. Gloves are nice to have as well, and a smoke absorber. The smoke goes through so that you're not inhaling any fumes. If you don't have one of these, just make sure you're working in a well-ventilated area. Next, we'll be going over all the tools you'll need. You'll need your soldering iron and a stand for it. Along with solder, I use 60/40 for just flat pieces like this. I also have two different kinds of flux. I prefer the gel flux. It's a lot easier to work with. Also, you need a way to keep your glass pieces together, so you can either use tape or metal push pins and blocks. And if you're interested in any of these items, you can find them linked in the description below. So before we get started with soldering, let's look at our iron. There's some things you'll need to know. Always keep your hands on the handle. Don't ever touch the tip. It's gonna be super hot. And when you're not using it, put it back in the stand. This is used for cleaning the tip of your iron. It's just like some kind of metal mesh, but some irons come with a sponge. And also this particular iron has a heat dial, and I keep mine between 360 and 410. Right now I have it on 410. Let's go ahead and plug our irons in and let them get heated up before we get started. So now we're ready to start soldering. Our iron is hot, and let's get our safety glasses on. The first step of soldering is using your flux. I'm gonna pour just a little bit here in this cup that I have. And then I have a brush, literally a flux brush, and you dip it in there. You don't need a lot, and you just want to lightly paint the copper foil seam. The reason we're going to be using flux is if you don't use flux, the solder won't bind to the copper foil. We're ready to solder. Let's go ahead and grab our iron. Be very careful because it's good and hot. I'm going to go ahead and clean off my tip first before I get started. And then we're going to hold the solder in between the glass and the iron. And I'm just going to allow the iron to melt the solder, and I'm just going to go ahead and tack it together. And then I'm going to solder the whole seam here, and I'm not gonna really worry too much about what it looks like. I'm gonna drag it off the edge right here. And it's okay if you get a little bit of solder on the glass, it'll come off. Just don't touch it, it's really hot. So I'm gonna add just a little bit more solder onto my iron, and I'm gonna go ahead and try to make it a little smoother, and then drag it off the edge again. Put your iron back and give it just a minute to cool off before we do the other side. If you're not happy with the way your line turned out, it's okay. We can go back over it again with the iron. You might want to give your glass some breaks in between because it does get really hot. And if you notice that the solder starts to leak through the other side, you really need to back off for a minute. You don't want to work too long and get your glass too hot, because if there's too much heat, it'll crack. If you're not happy with your solder line, you can always give it a minute to cool off and try it again. So now it's soldered together, and we can go ahead and peel the tape off the back, and we can do the other side. We'll need to use flux again. Make sure you just get a nice amount on there. We're gonna grab our iron and our solder, and going to get solder on the seam. And then we're going to go over it one more time just to smooth it out. So now the front and the back are both soldered. So that's how you solder. You think you can do it?
I mean, you made it look really easy. Doesn't look as hard as I thought it would, so I'm excited to give it a try.
Before we move on to Kurt, we're gonna go ahead and solder the edges of this piece to give it a more finished look. If you've got these rubber gloves, they're really great to use for this part where we're gonna do the edges. Or if you've got another kind of tool like pliers where you can just hold the piece while you're doing this, that might be helpful. So we're gonna go ahead and get all the copper foil fluxed just on top for now. This part, you don't really need a lot of solder, just a little bit. And we're just gonna drag it all the way around. So I like these gloves because of the rubber around the fingers. It helps the heat so that it doesn't feel hot. This is called tinning, when you put solder on copper foil. Let's flip it over and do the other side. We need flux. It won't stick if we don't use it. And we're just gonna lightly drag it all the way around the edges. So tinning the copper foil will make your piece look more finished and also will help make it stronger. When doing the sides, I always make sure that my piece is level because the solder is liquid and it'll be heavy on one side or the other if you're not level. Give it a second before we do the other sides. Just doing one side at a time, being patient. Right here I've got a little bump, so I'm just gonna lightly kind of flatten it. That's it. It's completely soldered. Now we're gonna have Kurt do his. How are you feeling now that you've seen the entire process?
I'm super excited for it. I think this process honestly probably looks like the most enjoyable part of it, so I'm excited to do it. So I will dip it in and then go ahead and paint across.
Yep. Now just hold your solder at the edge. He's got gloves on, so that'll help the solder from getting too hot. Yep.
I'm gonna clean the tip of the iron.
Yep. Hold the solder in between the glass and the iron.
This?
Yep. And go ahead and just put a little bead on the seam. Yep. So that you now know it's stuck together. You can do it in a couple different places.
I'm gonna do 2.
People have, different preferences on how they solder and do things, but this is what works for me. And I find it the most easiest. So yeah, you've got solder on there now.
Right.
You notice it's a little, uneven in places.
Yeah, there's some bumps.
Yeah, but that's okay. So just go ahead and start at the top and then just try to keep, an evenness about it. That looks great.
Now I have to let it sit for a minute.
Yeah, and if you want, we can go ahead and do the edges on this front side.
Okay, here's my piece. Now I'm gonna flip it over, remove my tape.
Beautiful.
Oh, I ran over.
It's okay. Soldering is very much just learning from experience and getting a feel for it. We're finished soldering. We want to make sure that our pieces get nice and cooled off before we clean it. If you're wondering what we use to clean, I use a glass cleaner that is ammonia free, or CJ's Flux Remover is also a really good product. That way you can get all the flux off and get ready to polish it afterwards. The reason we're going to clean it before we polish it is there's still lots of flux on here, and that's not good. It's gonna make the metal oxidize over time, and it's not good for our hands. It's a chemical that we don't want on there anymore. So we clean it off, let it dry, and then we polish it so that it's nice and shiny and beautiful and not ugly and dirty. I'm just gonna go ahead and use the glass cleaner. Just be really mindful if you're doing a piece where it's like this one with the copper foil on the edges and it's tinned. You don't want to get it overly wet and be too forceful to make it peel off. We just want to get it nice and clean on all sides, glass and solder. Maybe do it a few times to make sure you've got it really good and clean. Make sure you wash your hands after you've finished doing this part of the process because, again, we're working with chemicals and it's really not good for your skin, and you definitely don't want to get it in your eyes or in your food. So washing your hands before you do anything else is super important. All the little black burnt flux areas are gone. It's nice and shiny. Now it's safe to handle. So we have 2 soldered pieces of stained glass, and they are clean and our hands are clean, and we're able to show you how beautiful they are. I'm really anxious to find out how things went for you, Kurt.
I came into this thinking that this was gonna be like one of those super easy processes. Sarah made it look so easy whenever she was explaining and showing me the process for soldering. It's kind of tricky whenever you actually get in there and you're doing it yourself. You really have to be precise and have very cohesive lines whenever you're running your solder. But overall, I mean, it was a little bit harder than what I thought.
As you understand, you just kind of become more patient with yourself and just, enjoy it and have fun with it. We'll be making a lot more videos just like this one. If you have any questions at all, leave them in the comments below, and thank you guys so much for watching.
Subscribe.